we still need to consider the student development's vision and missions, and our vision is to be the driving force in fostering an inclusive campus community that develops active and engaged lifelong learners. Additionally, the mission enhances the student development enhances the mission of Millikan University by instilling the importance of institutional values, challenging and supporting students to meet and exceed their expectations, delivering quality programs and services that connect theory to practice, and cultivating performance learning opportunities in the co-curricular experience. So, tying this in today's topic, as paraprofessionals, we need to be inclusive with all of our students we come to meet. We need to support them in their time here at Millikan. It's also important to know that some of these students will be coming from completely different backgrounds than you. Some students may require you to have a little more patience than others in your communication, but also in the way that you approach their cultural backgrounds. We'll need to challenge some of the thoughts that come forward and actively engage in educational conversations. This is where you will all make an impact on students when you meet them and get to know them. And all of you have the ability to make a difference in the lives of the students that we will have coming to Millikan next year, and this is really magical if you think about it. SpongeBob magic. Thank you for your attention, and I will hand things over to Brianna.
So, we're going to talk about cultural competency today and how to strengthen our ability to communicate interculturally. So, before we start, my name is Brianna. I work downstairs in the Center for International Education. I'm the assistant director. In the CIE, we do everything international. We help international students get their visas and get settled and come to Millikan. And we also help Millikan students go abroad and study abroad and see the world and all of those great things. So how many of you have actually been abroad before? That's pretty good number. How many of you have lived abroad in another country before? Much less. Does anyone want to talk about, do you want to talk about your experience at all going abroad?
I would love to.
Great.
Hi guys, I'm Elizabeth. I just spent a semester abroad in London for one of the Northern Study Abroads. And that was really fun and very eye-opening to see how other cultures live and work. Like even just like the times that the grocery store is open is so totally different than it is here. It's definitely like even like how they cook and like the fridge size. It's basically everyone had a mini fridge, and like that's what everyone has is the mini fridge. So they go grocery shopping a lot more, and just like the different ways you say hello, the different like kind of ways you do things is completely and totally different, even though we speak the same language.
Definitely, I would say vacationing abroad with your family or going on a short-term, like 10-day immersion with a faculty member and a group of students is eye-opening, it's life-changing, but it's entirely different than leaving your whole family and friends and your support system to move to another country for 5 months or up to 4 years. And we have lots of students on Millikan's campus who have decided to do that, and you guys will work with them closely. How many LBs do we have in the room? What about international business majors? Someone? Okay. So LBs and international business majors, you guys will definitely hear from me like hounding at you to go abroad and take those opportunities. But even those of you that maybe you haven't considered going abroad as being an option for you, I hope that you do, and I hope that you come down and talk to us about how to make that happen. If you're anything like me, then just going to college was a privilege, and so I didn't really think that studying abroad was an option for me. It was considered more of a luxury than a necessity, and apparently 98% of college students in the United States agree, because only 2% of US college students went abroad last year, so super low number. But it's still going to be incredibly important for you guys to be able to communicate cross-culturally to be successful in your lives and to be even successful in this paraprofessional role. So, we're going to talk about how to do that today. At Millikan, we have 5% of our student body is international. We have almost 100 students from like 30 different countries, and their goal while they're here is to make a connection with you, to make a connection with Millikan and with the Decatur community as a whole. So first, let's talk about what is culture. Just shout it out, anyone, doesn't matter. Give me some ideas. What is culture?
I'm coaching.
Oh yeah. Culture is anything but just one person. One person can't be culture. Belief? Okay, beliefs, yeah. What else? Food?
History.
Yeah. Okay.
Lifestyle.
Yeah.
Holidays.
Language.
Language, yeah, that's a good one.
Music.
Music, for sure.
Food.
Yep. So the definition of culture is a set of values, beliefs, and shared way of life that a group of people engage in. It's group-oriented, so I am not a culture. A culture is never just one singular thing. Sorry. And it's used to achieve a set of goals, right? It's integrative and functional. It's neither good or bad. So a lot of times we confuse cultural with morality and say, you know, that's a bad part of culture. Those things are not necessarily always related. So I already asked for examples, but my favorite metaphor for culture is like this iceberg, right? So there, you can see just the very tip of the iceberg, and in culture, that's your language, your food, the way you dress. But beneath the water, where the bulk of the culture, the bulk of the iceberg is, that is your beliefs, the way that your political systems are set up, the traditions that you have, and your religious beliefs. So what about competency? What is competency? It's kind of harder to define. Let's give it a shot. Yeah.
It's like being culturally aware of other cultures and being empathetic, I guess, and putting yourself in their shoes in situations.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add to that? Yeah. Yeah. So competency is having knowledge, skill, and ability to do something successfully. So really it's being good at something, right? So then what is cultural competency? Is it being good at culture? Yeah.
It's being good at like being able to understand that everybody comes from a different place, so like not everyone is gonna be similar to how you think or how you act or how you react to certain things.
Yeah. So cultural competency is not being good at culture. That's not what I'm expecting. And sometimes when I give this presentation, people say, how am I supposed to know everything about every single culture? Again, no one's asking you to do that. That's not what cultural competency is. It's working with people and understanding that other people believe things differently than you based off of their own experiences and being able to work with them. So we're going to do a little exercise. Looking at this dot, these two dots, they look identical, right? They look like they're the same. But actually one of them is larger than the other. So just stare at it for a second. And let's show of hands. How many of you think that red dot is bigger? And how many of you think the blue dot is bigger? Purple, blue, whatever. So we're like about half and half. The red one, you think? Okay, so some of you think the blue, some of you think the red, but the reality is that I lied. They're the same size. Yeah, and that's the thing about culture, is that if you're a child and someone has been telling you your whole life that the blue circle is larger than the red, you may never question that. That might just be your beliefs. And if someone or a government or the media is telling a whole group of people this misinformation, culture, even if it's not true. So, this misinformation goes and passes down from generation to generation. And if we think about the United States, can we think of some traditions or things that maybe used to be considered culturally acceptable and they were ingrained in our culture, but now we're like, that's insane, of course, that's not cool. Yeah. Columbus Day, yeah, he's the worst. What else? Yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah, exactly. Offensive type of mascots and things like that. Appropriation. I feel like there's like one glaring one that we should be addressing. Slavery, hello. So everyone, slavery used to just be part of American culture. Does not make it right, obviously. Okay? I'm just going to show you this image here. And the only thing that I want you to do is just tell me something about this image. I'm going to write it. Yes.
The door is green.
The door is green. You can. Okay, window looking. What else do we see here?
The walls are worn down.
I'm sorry, what?
The walls are worn down.
Okay.
Family.
Family. What else? Yes.
The younger lady looks like she's in some sort of like distress from like how she's holding her head.
Okay. Distress. Yeah.
They don't dress like the same as like women do here.
Okay, so their dress is different. What else?
I don't know. It's easy to wear warm.
Warm. Yeah, that's good.
Warm like temperature.
Yeah, just put warm. Let's keep going. What else can we see in this picture?
Sunlight.
Yeah.
Bright colors. Youth and aging.
Youth and aging. Okay, that's good.
They got their toes out.
They what?
No shoes, toes.
Oh, okay. What else? Yeah.
I don't want to say trapped, but they're like, in an enclosed space because there's the light factor on them, but,
Okay, yeah. Trapped, enclosed, yeah.
The younger woman is more in the sunlight, and the older woman is in the dark.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Home.
Home? Yeah,
The older lady looks like she like praying or something like that.
okay. Praying maybe, or
She looks relaxed.
I was gonna say like she looks like fragile.
fragile?
Yeah, she's fragile.
Now we're talking. What else? Yeah. Were you gonna say something?
If I was to really get deep, I was gonna say something like the younger lady, she got the light on her because she's like the future for their culture.
Yeah. Okay, so we're looking up here at all the things that Nicole wrote for us here. Relaxed, fragile, trapped, youth and aging, dress differently, family. So based off of this, you can see that sometimes we tend to analyze reality based on our own point of view. And we can make premature judgments or conclusions based off a group of people or an image. And that's just human nature. We just do that. When someone walks in the room, sometimes we tend to analyze or make stereotypes and judgments about who they are before we actually know anything about who they are. So we're gonna take a little different approach to this, and we're gonna try to slow it down a little bit. And we're gonna start with, we're gonna use this like DIVE method. And DIVE stands for description, interpret, verify, and then evaluate. Instead of jumping from looking at this picture and saying family or trapped or, praying, we're going to just keep it objective. And so you guys did a pretty good job at that, honestly, with the green door, window, walls looking worn down. Those are what we want to see first whenever we're looking at something or a situation. We need to look at it objectively. And not necessarily always our gut instinct of a situation is going to be accurate. It's important to take it into consideration, but it's also important to question why you believe the things that you believe and make sure that those things are realistic and accurate. So then we would want to interpret what you're thinking, like what you think about what you see. So that is like the person maybe representing the future of, the family, or maybe their religious backgrounds, or the fact that they're family. That's us interpreting what we think, but we do not know whether or not any of that information is actually true. It's just what we're feeling. And then we want to try to verify those two things. Is any of that actually even true? In this situation, we're not going to verify it, but we could. We could look up who took this photograph and see what was happening in the picture whenever it was taken and figure out what was actually going on. But in a situation where you're interacting with another international student, or you have questions about something from a cultural standpoint, it's easy to verify that information. But it's important to do it respectfully, right? And then last, we want to evaluate. So sometimes we tend to jump to the evaluation first and say what it is, or what we know to be true, or this interpretation of how it makes us feel, without doing the first three things. Does that make sense? So sometimes instead of being curious and trying to understand something, we jump to conclusions. The media, our family, our peers, they all influence the way that we think and the way that we make these judgments. So with this DIVE approach, you can kind of slow it down, question some of those generalizations and stereotypes, instead of going straight to the evaluating. One more time. But we're going to try to categorize this time first. Do we have like an eraser, maybe?
We got a tissue.
Thanks.
Thank you. It's a clean tissue. It's a clean tissue.
You might want to jump to some conclusions when we look at this picture initially. But let's try to keep it objective first of all. So can we do different color for each? Yeah. So we're going to do description first. So give me something completely objective. Sand. Great. The job. Okay.
2 sides.
2 sides.
Volleyball.
Volleyball. Yelling. Is yelling happening? Can we hear yelling? Can we see? And it feels like an interpretation to me. Yeah. Sport, yes. Blocking. Jumping.
They are both women.
Yep, winning. And again, right? Is that an is it? We don't know. Are they both women? What else? Huh? I can't hear you. Clothing? Oh, clothing, sorry. Got it. Okay. Now let's go to interpretation. So how do you feel when you look at this picture? What is the feel? Maybe now we can put yelling in interpretations, right? Yelling, maybe like a aggression or something, competition. What else?
Excitement.
Excitement. What? Athletic. Losing. Winning, losing. Okay. And the verification side of this, I mean, again, we could go and look up and see, so this is from the 2016 Olympics, and we could look at, you know, what the photographer says about this photograph and verify the things in it, right, which we should do if we're going to be actually making any sort of sound judgment about them. But then what about your evaluations? Based off this description and your interpretations, evaluate it for me. Let's summarize it.
Sports brings people together and rallies.
Great. That's his interpretation, right? That's his own perception, his own interpretation. Sports bring people together. What else?
Sports tear people apart.
Okay. Yeah. Different perceptions, right?
There's a line.
What else? Yeah.
Sports creates an equal playing ground for people from all walks of life.
Okay. Let's do one more. Give me one more evaluation.
Two sides can be equal.
Okay.
What was that?
Two sides can be equal. So nothing about these evaluations are right or wrong. What's important to understand is that they aren't right or wrong, they just are. They are people's own evaluations based off their own personal experiences, how sports make them feel, or how differences coming together, you know, those types of things is all individual, it's all based off of your own perspective. So how can you use this technique, this dive technique, in your day-to-day lives or in your paraprofessional work? Yeah. No, it's fine. Yeah, I wasn't looking at you, but it's fine, Allison. What were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say, instead of going off of what you think of a situation at first, take a step back and evaluate what's around you instead of just going with your gut.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'd say like just think like no matter where they come from, treat them all the same. Treat them all the same.
Yeah.
The big process and like the friendships and working with international students, I make this a very open process. So it's something that with each step I do with them. And so it's like if I see something taking place or something mentioned in a conversation, I then like talk to them about it and kind of like be like, oh, this is kind of what I'm interpreting, but you tell me like why you're doing X or what is Y and everything. And so it's something that we come together. So I'm giving them a voice and then also like working on my own knowledge of all the different cultures that we have even just on our campus.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So like for this is kind of like what RAs and like commensurate or SI, like, a lot of us have to do groups oriented things or program oriented things, and you do that so that's what we're competency and involve different things that you're like, if you're gonna talk about a certain subject, don't just talk about things that's unique to, you know, Decatur or Illinois or even the United States, you know, just be open-minded about different topics and different activities.
So important. There are different viewpoints based off of, you know, where you're at in the globe or where you came from. And it's important to take those things into consideration. So maybe seeing or speaking with an international student is something that's new to you. And as Americans, we tend to maybe be a little bit standoffish. Not because we don't want to be friends with an international student, but because it's uncomfortable to put yourself out there, or to worry that you're not going to be able to understand what they're saying or pronounce their name correctly. So just slow down and just take a minute to evaluate why you're apprehensive about interacting with someone and try to break down those stereotypes or concerns that you have and just put yourself out there. The best way to grow is to put yourself in uncomfortable situations. Get out of your comfort zone. So, the definition that I like of cultural competency is that it's the ability to work effectively with others who define problems differently than yours. But acquiring this cultural competency takes time. Be patient with yourself. For those of you who haven't ever worked with a diverse population of people, or someone from another country, or someone who has limited English ability, it's okay. It's a developmental process. No one expects you to be perfect or to know everything about all the cultures. And this goes for individuals, and it goes for organizations as a whole, countries, communities. It's not just on an individual basis. I don't think I can reiterate enough that it really takes time, so be patient with yourself. Being able to integrate and transform knowledge about individuals and groups of people into specific standards, practices, and attitudes, used in appropriate settings to increase quality of services, thereby producing better outcomes. Right? It's why Paul and Starla asked me to come talk to you today, because Millikan as a whole wants to be more inclusive. We're very diverse, but diversity doesn't always equal inclusion. Inclusion is something that you work at when you have a diverse population. And as a service, so what you all are providing, it's being respectful and responsive to different beliefs and practices and linguistic needs of diverse populations. So that's what we need from you. Ask respectful questions. Make sure that you're getting the information that you need, but you're doing it in a way that doesn't hurt someone else. So I don't think that most people intend to be racist. I would like to think that they don't, but unintentional racism is still racism. It doesn't matter if you didn't intend for it to come off that way, right? So interact willingly and appropriately, identify, recognize, and be able to articulate the understanding of cultural differences in verbal and nonverbal cues. So when you're talking with an international student and they seem really closed down and they're hard to talk to, or they don't open up to you, try to figure out why that is. Is it a personal thing? What can you do to help them be more engaged? Identify and recognize new perspectives and be able to articulate insights in your own cultural biases. So making sure that you're evaluating yourself and how your interactions with other people from diverse backgrounds are affecting how they're responding to you. The way that you deal with conflict resolution may and definitely will not be the same as the way that an Asian student deals with conflict resolution, right? So it's important to understand those differences and know that just because it's the way you would prefer to do it, it's like how you did with your exercises today. It was a perfect segue into my presentation. You guys all did it differently. Doesn't necessarily mean one is right or wrong. It just is. Demonstrate understanding of other cultures in regards to their political system, their values, their economy. Educate yourselves. We're really bad about that in America. We don't necessarily learn a lot about other countries. We're very ethnocentristic in that, the United States is number one and everyone is better than everyone else and English is the only language that matters, and that is not, that's not obviously hopefully how you all feel, but that can be the general stereotype of Americans. You don't want to perpetuate that stereotype. If you have friends from other cultures, ask them about their home and their family and their values and how you can help make them feel more welcome. And then identify and recognize and interpret intercultural experiences from a perspective of more than one worldview, which is exactly what this gentleman was talking about just earlier. Making sure that you know that it comes from different perspectives and that not one is different than the other. One that can be frustrating to Americans is time. Time is very cultural, and in America, we're obsessed with time. If something happens at that time, you're gonna be there at that time or a few minutes before for something, class or a rehearsal or this training. You're there whenever the time says to be there. But that's not necessarily always how it goes. I was invited to a wedding for one of my Afghan students, and on the invitation it says 5:30 p.m. My husband and I showed up to the venue at 5:20 to find a place to park and make sure that we could get seated. We walk in, and the only other people there are 2 other white people. And we're like, "Are you here for the wedding?" And they're like, "Yeah." And so we're just hanging out for a while. 6 o'clock rolls around, no one is there still. 6:30, finally 7 o'clock, some people start coming in to set up decorations and stuff. That's how early we were, literally. About 8:30 p.m. or so, they actually started the wedding. I mean, the invitation said 5:30, and we were the only people, because we were the only people not from that cultural background, that knew not to show up for another 3 hours. Time is cultural. It is.
So often when we think about culture, we look outwardly. We try to understand and figure out others' cultural practices and beliefs. And although this can be important, another crucial part of intercultural communication is to look introspectively at our own assumptions, values, and norms. And as global integration and immigration continue to increase at an exponential rate, never has there been a more important time to focus on our relationships and our communication in intercultural spaces. Over the next few minutes, I will describe some techniques for enacting an introspective approach to culture. This is an approach in which we continually and critically question our assumptions and work to deconstruct the stereotypes which we might have. So, over the past 40 years or so, there's been this large number of industries that have come up with these cultural competency programs in response to rapid globalization. Many of these programs are designed to make practitioners more competent in their knowledge of others' cultural practices and beliefs, such as appropriate hand gestures and personal space boundaries. However, in recent years, scholars and practitioners have begun to notice the shortcomings of such approaches. For instance, in one training that tried to train medical practitioners about Latino culture, it was found that Latino patients received less pain medication than other patients with similar ailments, based on the assumption that their pain was over-exaggerated. And so, in response to these cultural competency trainings, authors and researchers Melanie Terlebon and John Marie Garcia contend that instead of learning some fixed body of cultural know-how, we need to enact cultural humility, these processes of ongoing self-reflection. And so, building on the notion of cultural humility, the first strategy for working introspectively involves working with others and coming over our cultural know-how, going beyond our cultural know-how. And so, in order to do that, first we must resist the urge to essentialize and generalize culture. Post-colonial writer Dariat Spivak terms essentializing as the process through which we reduce a culture down to a select number of traits. We've all done that, right? I mean, at some point in time. So, for instance, you might think about French culture, and you might think about sitting in a cafe in the middle of the day, drinking a glass of wine and smoking a cigarette. But is that all there is to French culture? And if the culture is not our own, we're predisposed to use stereotypes about those cultures to inform ourselves about it. And sometimes that can lead us into making some crazy assumptions. The other thing is, with essentializing, so reducing down, we also generalize. We lump people together from particular places, and we expect them to conform to our stereotypes. And so ponder for a minute. We're all here in the United States of America. If someone were to ask us, what is American culture? Can you define that for me? We would likely provide a variety variety of responses based on our own personal experiences here in the United States. Stereotypes would also likely inform our different orientations and ideas about cultural practices in the United States. So an example that highlights this is one time I was teaching a English culture class, English ESL and culture class to a group of refugees. And we came on the topic of sports, and at that time, the Cleveland Cavaliers were in the National Basketball Association finals. And some of the members of the class were really curious about this. They started hearing, there was big hype around the Cleveland Cavs, and they said, you know, hey, how's this game work? I can only name LeBron James, you know? And I know absolutely nothing about basketball. I'm like, can you pick it up and like throw it in the air? I have no idea. So to their dismay, I had no idea about these things. And something that really stuck with me is when one of my students said to me, he said, but Daniel, aren't you American? And from there, the class began to question whether or not I was Swedish. So they thought that, and it wasn't quite true. And so although this instance is humorous and lighthearted, the problem is that sometimes these assumptions can be very presumptuous and fraught with racist notions, and we don't know that we're doing it. And so we need to think about that. And so surely we're all going to generalize and essentialize. This is inevitable. And so this introspective approach to culture that I'm talking about tells us that we don't need to adhere to some pristine cultural morality in which we no longer generalize. That's not going to happen. But rather, such an approach asks us to continuously question our assumptions and look introspectively at the ways in which our personal experiences and our personal knowledge can create and perpetuate stereotypes. And so this leads into the second fundamental strategy to this introspective approach. And it's called reflexivity. And reflexivity goes beyond evading stereotypes and prompts us to reflect and think during our cultural interactions and after. And so on one level, reflexivity is enacted in fleeting moments where we just take a moment to stop and pause. And we don't do that often enough. But then on another level, we can practice reflexivity before and after interactions in intercultural spaces. And we can do this through jotting down notes, just musing for a while, journaling, talking with a friend about our experiences. And so when we're doing this, we need to silence the assumption-making demons in our head. The other important part is we need to ask our questions more humbly. And whoever said there are no bad questions, they were very, very wrong. I'm under the belief that they were. And so, for instance, Professor of History and Political Science, Curtis Keene, he notes that when Americans meet people from Africa, oftentimes the very first question they ask is, what tribe are you from? And so Curtis Keene goes on to point out the ways in which this can be really offensive and loaded with assumptions. First, Africa is an incredibly diverse continent. It's huge. And to describe the social and political structures in that continent and reduce it down to just tribe is completely incorrect. And then the other part is, sometimes we think about tribe and it's associated with primitiveness. And it perpetuates fallacious stereotypes of Africa as savage or backwards. And this is not true. And so, although these kind of questions are formed with curious intentions, it's very fun to learn about where other people are from. We all want to do that, right? Like, that's what's fun about living in an intercultural world. But what we need to do is we need to look more introspectively at how our assumptions can hinder us in the way that we can add those assumptions into our intercultural communication. And so the next thing is we need to get rid of this learned cultural expertise. In this day and age, we like to learn about culture, and I do it all the time. I'm so guilty of it all the time, and I notice myself thinking, like, I'm the expert, and people will ask me, they'll say, oh, you've been to Africa? Tell me about what they do in Africa. And I'm like, well, I don't really know, because I've been to, like, 5 cities, you know? And so when we're thinking about this, when we're relinquishing ourselves of expertise, we need to go beyond what we read on the internet. So I have this story. when I went to Morocco, and before I went on the internet to learn about the taboos and culturally appropriate customs of Morocco. And in many ways, this served me well. I learned that you eat with your right hand, and you put your hand on your heart to say nice to meet you. And these things were really helpful because people were very happy that I took the time to learn. But sometimes it sent me astray. So an instance of this is, in Morocco, dogs, I read on the internet, on this website, should never be in the house. They're considered dirty. They are considered dangerous. You shouldn't go and touch a dog on the street. This is just a bad, bad thing to do. So I was like, all right, I see a dog, I'm not touching it. Like, get out of there. And there's a lot of stray dogs. And so one day my friend invited me to his home for dinner. And he's like, all right, come over to my house, Daniel. Really love to have you. I want to introduce you to my father. And I walk into the house, and the first thing I see is my friend's father sitting on the couch with this tiny little dog on his lap. And he's petting it, and I think the dog, I forget what the dog's name was, but, so like, I go up to him, and with curious intention, I go up and I say, hello, and I say, why do you have a dog in your house? Isn't that taboo in Morocco? To which he responded, for some people, yes, but for me, I really like my dog. So I go to my friend's house for dinner, and the first question, I didn't say, like, how are you? I just say to him, isn't that taboo in Morocco? Based on something that I had read on the internet. And so, although like this wasn't super detrimental to the relationship, sometimes when we impose our assumptions and put them into our questions, they can. And so, through practicing reflexivity, this really crucial part of an introspective approach, we can take the time to make pauses in our communication and think, just think, is there an assumption in there? And then, so an introspective approach can be drastically helpful in improving our relationships in intercultural spaces. And now, more than ever, in a social and political climate that demonizes refugees and immigrants, we need to look inside of ourselves for ways to support and welcome people from diverse cultural backgrounds. And ultimately, an introspective approach, looking inside of ourselves, lets us to focus less on culture and more on individuals as human beings. Thank you so much.
So when international students come here, what do you think are some stereotypes or perceptions or biases that they're expecting to see whenever they come to America? What do you think international students expect before they come here?
White picket fences.
White picket fences, yeah. What else? Yeah.
We drive literally everywhere, no matter how short of the distance, because we're kind of lazy.
Yeah. Other things?
Attractions everywhere.
Yeah.
Bad eating habits.
Unhealthy food. Yeah.
Over-idolization of thumbs.
Yeah. So there's three things that are most common, I think, for what I hear whenever we get new international students coming. The first thing is that they think that there are literally celebrities everywhere. They think that they're just gonna walk down the street and see Johnny Depp, getting his mail or something. Especially almost all of them making it a point to go to California or LA because they're certain that they're gonna see famous people while they're there. The other thing is that they think that everyone has a gun on their hip. We are just toting guns around left and right and that anyone can have it. Right, these perceptions are not true. They're totally untrue. And you guys have those same biases, even if, you're cultured or you're from a diverse background, we still have these different misinterpretations. And one of the large ones that we've been facing more and more is with our African student population. Millikan has more African students on campus than any other group of students. We have more than 30 students from East Africa, from Rwanda, the Congo, and Burundi. And more often than not, they are faced with these weird, insensitive questions and things that just are not true, and they're based only off of what Americans have seen in the media or on movies. So try to make sure that if you're about to ask, you know, an African student what tribe they're from, evaluate yourself, because that is totally inaccurate. And one thing is that the largest population of students is from Rwanda, and maybe you guys don't know this, but Rwanda is a highly developed country. It's third in the world for women's rights, which is way above the United States, and it's number 1 in the world for having women in their government. They're not like this poor country where people are living in huts and things like that. So educate yourself and make sure that you're being respectful whenever you're asking questions. Just like you don't want to be generalized into some like racist, gun-toting American, the other international students on our campus don't want to be generalized or put into those weird boxes that we just create based off of our background. What else can you do? Don't be in denial. Like I said, I sometimes get students that are like, I am culturally accepting and things like that. I'm certain that's true. I hope that is true. But you still have your own set of biases. And you can look, you can take like tests online to literally point out where you might have different stereotypes and things that you can adjust and change. And you should do that. Reflect on your assumptions about people. Whenever someone walks into a room and you immediately make a judgment about them, that doesn't say anything about the person that's standing in the room, but it says everything about you. So make sure that you're questioning that. Why do you believe that? Is that even true? You know, use that dive method that we talked about. Ask respectful questions. Please ask respectful questions. If you're not sure if a question is respectful and you need some information, don't just blurt it out. Come find me or someone else who can help you. Right? And be open-minded about differences. There are multiple ways to think about things, and the only reason we think the things we do is because of our own experiences. Yeah.
I just think, I feel like this is all really targeted towards international students, correct? I just wanted to voice something that I think is also important to, that this could apply to as well, and that's within our relationships in the United States.
Absolutely.
There are so many preconceived notions towards cultural groups that already live here and have been living here. So whether you are somebody who considers yourself like culturally, what's the word again?
Competent.
Yeah, competent, or very accepting. I think it's so important that no matter, no, well, here's my biggest thing, ethnicity in particular is not linked to culture at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think that's something that's important to voice within our nation and the people that we are around with on campus on the daily. So yeah, I think this is all just super beautiful, and I love everything that we're being told and like learning from. But I think it's super important to not just apply this to the international students, because it's easy to meet someone from a different country and like clearly you're going to be different culturally, but you'd be surprised at the same time that again, culture, I feel like it's a plastic thing. And
There are more connections than there are differences.
Exactly.
If you look at the person instead of their culture and their country and their religious beliefs and their traditions, if you just take the person, you'll find that you will not have those weird, disconnect that you're afraid that you're gonna have. It's not, yeah, you're right. Getting to know people from different backgrounds, regardless of if they're international. So I work with the international student population, and I want you guys to work well with them. But like she said, it's not just about the international students on campus. It's about every single person here. Everyone has different experiences. Yeah.
It's an awesome thing.
Yeah, exactly. You're totally right. Thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything or have any questions? Yeah.
I just want to say, like, as FIAMs, if you have never been a FIAM before, you, like, do international student orientation with them, and, like, you kind of pointed out earlier, some of them speak English, like, way better than others, and so, like, for example, I had a group of students from France, and, like, one of them spoke English really well, and the rest of them were just kind of like, hey, say this, and so, like, whenever they would all be speaking French, I would just be like, instead of being like, hey, you speak English, I'd be like, hey, like, I want to know what you're talking about, like, what's going on here, like, include me, so, like, just, like,
orientation for PM training, like, I'll come and do a little more in depth about that. But in general, there's a couple of glaring issues that sometimes we have, which is like name pronunciation. We'll have someone come and like, their name is something that is uncommon for the American tongue to try to say. And so someone will say, let me just call you this instead. What? No. Like if someone tells you what their name is, it is not your, you have no right to just give them a different nickname because it's easier for you to pronounce. Practice. Record it, write it down, ask them to repeat themselves, whatever you have to do. Something as simple as learning how to say someone's name correctly makes a difference while you're building a relationship with them. If you don't even want to take the time to say their name correctly, then they're not going to feel very connected or open with you. And the same with language. If you don't understand what somebody's saying, ask them to word it differently. Ask them to write it down. Don't just dismiss them or shake your head yes, or because you don't want to make them feel bad. What's going to make them feel bad is knowing that you didn't understand their question and didn't help them. Help them understand and help them learn. Anything else? Well, thank you guys for letting me come and give you my spiel today.
Okay, so I know it's like 3:20, so we still have a little bit of time left, but we're not going to take the rest of the time completely. So, one of the things that I kept on hearing throughout that presentation, and a lot of things I know I try to remind as we work with parapros, especially I work closely more with the RAs, is everybody needs to be a human, right? So this is this whole process. So for those of you as you came in through, and especially for those of you that are returners, I also ask returners and new staff members to really think about how are you a human, how are you a member of the community, what would you like to see in your position, how do you want to move forward, and also start to take this time to not only develop yourself as an individual, but who are you in the group, right? So that's really big and important. So we're going to talk a little bit more about groups, and then we're going to let you go. But before I get into that, you all got an email from Van Rental or maybe Bev Krause about getting van certified, right? Yes? Did anybody not get an email? Okay, good. That's a good sign. So there's an online component that you take, okay? So you have to do that component. If you have already been van certified before, you do have to redo it. It's an annual process, so I do not control that. It's all public safety. So please make sure that you do that. We talked about that last week as an expectation, etc. If you have an individual concern about actually getting behind a 12-passenger van or something like that, talk to your direct supervisor and we can get that part figured out. But we do expect that you're van certified. Now, we had set aside dates that you would actually do the behind the wheel. That is TBD right now, so there's some things that we're having to work out with public safety. So we will be in contact back with you all when that part will happen. So I believe in your letter or maybe your supervisor talked to you about certain dates already, like this upcoming Sunday, I believe was one of those. Those dates are probably going to be modified and changed a little bit, but you should have it done by the end of the semester by May 17th, which is my birthday. By May 17th on that Friday. Great, yes, I'm a Taurus, if you believe in. Yeah. So, pause. The dates, what I'm saying is, ignore the dates for right now because public safety is having to rework some stuff. Okay? So, by the end of the semester, we will re-communicate that with you. So, I don't want you to wait on one of those days and those not work anymore. So, we will be sending that updated information to you first. Okay? The other thing is, if any of you have any remaining background check, any other paperwork or things like that, please make sure that you do get that to your direct supervisor. The background check forms, raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about, background check forms. Okay, I see some little hands. We have to turn those in and they all get processed at one time. So if those are late, those are not gonna work as well. So the earlier you can make sure you can get that in. If you haven't done that already, please do that to your direct supervisor. So van certification, do the online component, wait for the actual behind the wheel, and then paperwork. Cool? Any questions about those two things? Going once. Going twice. Okay, sold to, and I know Steph Brown was here a little bit ago, but she had talked a bit about in front of you, you have these spaghetti noodles and pieces of marshmallow, right? So I want to go back to this opening activity that you all did. So
why do you think we did this activity, not only for you as groups, but why was that important to build the tallest tower? Why was that important? Yes.
To work on communication.
Work on your communication, yes. What else?
Work toward the goal.
Work toward a goal, right? So it's really important. So for those of you, even though today is going to be one of the last days that we're back all together as one group, we'll get back together in the fall, is the goal is we're all continuing to work together to have a really good paraprofessional experience, not only for you, but these incoming students and current students at the university, right? So I think that those spaghetti pieces and those little pieces of marshmallow can be students. So how do you see those as students? Anybody else see those as students? Yes.
So like college is like something that's scary to like start. So us being like the first people that they meet, we're able to like build them up to like be able to see like what they're able to do, their potential of like being here. Because I mean, like somebody said, like going to college itself is a privilege. So like not everybody's gonna be comfortable with doing something they're not used to doing. So us being there for them is their chance to like be able to build up to be a better version of themselves.
Yeah, awesome. Who else? Yep.
Well, in the process, one of our marshmallows ended up being highly damaged and everything, and so you never know the backgrounds of these students coming in, and so like many of them are like survivors and everything, but yet they can still be successful and everything, and so learning how to like work with them and work along them and being their advocates and cheerleaders, so they can make towers of their own.
So I think what's so cool is this idea, if you think of the spaghetti and the marshmallows as students, is that each of you came up with a very different depiction, right? So if you think of you as a group of RAs, or you as a group of residential academic peer mentors, you as a group of PMs, SI, all the other groups that we have represented here today, you all have a different way of interpreting and shaping the experience of that student, right? Or students, right? And you're going to come up with it, it's going to look a little bit different. But the goal is that you are going to work through this group process probably in a very similar way. So where are my business majors here in the room? Okay? Where are my comm majors here in the room? Communication majors, some lowly, I was a communication major in undergrad, Joe. I was always told I got a BA in BS, so look at this. I'm glad some of you got that joke. I do dad jokes all day, every day. Okay. So in front of you, there should be one little diagram that's printed in blue. Well, it's on pink paper, but printed in blue. And then you all should have got this little handout. How many of you have heard of this before? Forming, storming, norming, performing. Okay, I see some hands. It's a nice little alliteration to remember. But as you're going on and starting to think about this really starting to continue to build upon your group experience, is where are you at in developing your own group? Magically, on August 26th, we're going to let you all loose, and you're going to have your seminar class, your residence hall floor, your community, and we're going to say go. And you're going to be like, what the hell do I do, right? You know? So I really want you to start to think about and envision these 4 different steps of developing group, right? So on your table, there should be a nice little diagram that kind of breaks down the 4 visually. I put that out there for visual learners if that's helpful for you all. I also had a printing issue in the office, or you all would have got copies, but that's okay. And so stage 1 is this idea of forming. So high dependence on the leader for guidance and direction. So think about you all coming in today, and we said, here's the task that you need to do, right? If Katie didn't give you the directions, you would all start to stare at each other, right? Or somebody probably per table would have been like, what are we doing, right? Okay. How many of you can think about experiences like that, right? Okay. Okay. So little agreement on teams' aims on other than received from the leader. Individual roles and responsibilities are unclear. Leader must be prepared to answer lots of questions about the team's purpose, objectives, and external relationships. Process are often ignored. Members test tolerance of system and leader direct. So where are my returners? Raise my hand, returners. So think about your first semester as a parapro. That first day, that first class, that first floor meeting program. Do you agree that that was forming, right? Okay. What do you remember about that from your perspective about forming and forming that group for those returners? What was that like? And was it like herding cats? Yes. Okay. What else, Colin?
It was really
Really testy, okay? Okay. What else? Yeah.
Me personally, I feel like it was a little bit awkward because it's like my group is like it was freshman on the edge and I'm only a year older than them, so it wasn't like I got so much say so of what they can do, but it was more like I'm just trying to direct them to do the right thing.
That's a great reminder, is that some of you are only like a year or a few months older than some of these people, right? I'm only 37. That doesn't mean because I'm 37 I know more than you. I'm just older. So, you know, so I think it's having that perspective though sometimes is important. What else? Yeah.
You're like trained and you think it's gonna go a certain way and then maybe it doesn't.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I think you have to also in this step of the process as that individual leader be confident in yourself. I'm not saying you need to fake it to make it. But you also need to be able to come in and start the group, right? Really start that process. So if you go back to your table activity, who kind of took charge from the beginning in each group? Raise your hand if you were the person that kind of took charge. Okay. Don Rico, why'd you take charge? I'm picking on you, buddy. Previous experience, okay. Did you just feel inclined to do that?
I looked at my group and I took initiative, but I realized like 90% of my group was already ahead, so we all kind of had the same mentality.
Okay. So some of you have already done the activity before. Okay. Okay. Who else at their table kind of took charge? Yep, Toby.
Well, I kind of like an idea of how to make something that's tall and last.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've already done it before.
Yep.
So just my previous experience.
You had a vision, right? You're like, we're going to do this. Now, for everybody else at Toby's table, did you know Toby's vision? Yeah? No, I didn't see it. No. I saw it this way or this way, right? Okay. Yeah? Okay. So the next step, so that's kind of forming. Everybody's coming together. Sometimes we also call this the honeymoon phase. Everybody's like, I love you, it's great, everything's going to be awesome. But what do you know about that? It doesn't last forever, right? Okay. So the next stage is called storming. So, and again, some of this makes quite a bit of sense, but decisions don't always come easily within a group. Team members vie for position as they attempt to establish themselves in relation to the other team members and the leader. So thinking about who kind of said in the first group, I'm going to take charge, and now somebody's like, you're full of whatever, I'm going to take charge now, or I can do this better, or you know, everybody starts to kind of vie for different positions or kind of start to understand maybe what we were going to do, maybe isn't what everybody else thought they were going to do. So there's a lot of power struggle, right? So thinking back to your activity earlier today, and I know we only gave you 10 minutes, so this is like a micro example. Was there any storming that happened in your activity? You can be honest, or you can, yeah?
We had to decide if we wanted to use like the full length noodles, if we want to like break them in half.
Okay. So what did you guys decide?
We broke those babies in half.
You broke the babies in half, okay?
It worked out.
And everybody eventually agreed to that, right? Okay, so that kind of gets to the next step. Okay, who else stormed in their group? Yep.
Yeah, I just feel like we storm because we got a lot of strong personalities.
Okay.
So we just, when everybody's got something to say, it's just kind of hard to just
Yep.
go back and just get all on the same page.
Okay. Get all on the same page. So, how many, by a show of hands, like conflict in this room? Maybe that's why their table good. Okay, let's see a few more hands. Who are my conflict avoiders in the room? Okay, lots of hands. Okay, so my challenge to you, for those people, either if you think back to the activity or at some point have been in conflict, when you saw the other side of the conflict, was it so bad? Maybe it wasn't always so good, but was it always completely so bad? Okay. Think of a time where you had to have the conflict to improve a relationship, maybe a situation, maybe yourself, right? You have to eventually at some point, because again, back to communication, there's no way that everything that I'm thinking and feeling is what you're thinking and feeling. And that's called a miscommunication. The same thought and feeling is not conveyed between two people. So you have to go through the storming phase. So for those people that are like, conflict, I don't like that, that's a piece that I think you're gonna have to work on and really lean on those other people that are here within your team, within your paraprofessional role or your supervisor. Because conflict is important. And I know some of us in Residence Life talk a lot about conduct and conflict and all that kind of stuff. I would have been in your shoes with the I don't like conflict whenever I was a young college student at one point, and then I realized there's a lot of benefit that happens because, again, it moves the process along. It's just as important. Not everybody can be 100% happy all the time, A. And B, it's that a lot of times the reason there's conflict is that there's something important that needs to happen. Okay, there's a part of the process. For those of you that got to the example of, hey, we're gonna decide that we're all gonna break down the spaghetti noodles into smaller pieces. You guys came to a consensus and decided that was something you all are gonna do, which is good. Norms are also whenever you as a group decide what are the expectations that maybe you've talked about before that maybe you now put on paper, right? For those of you that are in fraternity and sororities, you have set expectations of your group, not only because of the letters that you wear, but because of the standards and things that you guys are already prescribed to. You all, because you're parapros, also have a list of expectations that are given to you by your supervisor, whether that be how you communicate, when you communicate, how often do you let us know, is this a scenario, what's the protocol, etc. So, a lot of this stage is this idea of you facilitating. So did anybody other than I know this group get to us, you felt like you got through storming, got through the conflict, and were into norming in the activity earlier? Why? Why, Colin, would you say that?
Because we weren't really having a lot of discussion.
Okay.
Overall, everybody kind of got the gist of what we were doing pretty early, and then everybody just kind of was like, how we look up, and all of a sudden we had like a whole other leg up. No one was really directing that, it was just kind of happening.
And not to pick on Colin, did everybody else feel that way in the group? Yeah? Okay. Good. Okay, and the last part is called performing. So this idea of really overall, you as a group is more strategically aware, and you clearly know what you're doing and why you're doing it. The thing I want to remind you is that a lot of times groups get stuck between storming and norming before they ever get to performing. Why do you think that is? Colin?
Because sometimes the stress of going through the storming phase is a little bit more than you can handle, and it doesn't actually get to progress to the next stage.
You get to a conflict, you norm it and kind of reset the expectation, and you have another conflict and go back to storming. So that's kind of where the group ends up being a lot, and that's when you call it drama, right? Drama, right? So that's a really big component for you to start to think about is for your group to really perform, sometimes you do have to work through that. The other thing I think you have to think about is that sometimes for your group to understand it completely, you have had to see it from the other side. So that's why I think it's so important that we have returners and we have new staff members, because as a new staff member, you may feel very much like, wow, this is a lot to understand. So the other thing I think that's important to understand with performing is that you know, at the end of the day, it's kind of this natural, really cool process. So when you can step aside and be like, wow, look what was created, especially when you think about working with people, right? Because everybody's an individual, everybody's a human. It's really important to start to think about the awesome things that are going to happen within a group. Now, if you as a parapro are working with your team, with your floor, with your class, etc., and realize that they have not got to performing, what does that mean for you? Are you a bad parapro? Question mark. I see Elizabeth saying yes. Why do you say yes?
I'm being silly.
Okay, she thinks so. Does anybody feel like that's a yes? Okay, why is it a no then for my people that aren't answering? If you're saying no, why is it a no?
Can you repeat your question?
So for those of you as a paraprofessional working your class, your group, your section through this process, is it important that everybody your group gets to performing? Yes or no? You feel a yes. But what if they don't get to performing? Is that bad?
It's not necessarily that it's bad, it's just that not everybody can perform at the same rate as everybody else can.
Okay.
Everybody needs a different, like if I can do something fast, that doesn't mean like Naomi can do something the same rate, you know what I'm saying? Like
Right.
everybody has to be able to, in order to grow, you have to be able to work at your own pace. Like you're not supposed to rush how fast you can do something. Like you have to go at your pace so you're comfortable and like you can grow and you're doing whatever
Yep.
you're trying to do.
So So you don't want to leave anybody behind, right? So it's very likely in your group process, in your paraprofessional position, that you will not get to performing. And that doesn't make it bad, but it might be because somebody along the whole way never was a part of the group, right? And so as we talk about people being humans and talk about including people, I think that's another important thing to think about. What else? Why do you think, yep?
You can guide people in a certain way, but they're still gonna make their own decisions.
Correct. So everybody's still an individual, right? So thinking about the experiences that you've had in groups, and a number of you probably are like, I don't like group work, but welcome to Millikan. A lot of things are group work. That's life. You have to work with other people. You're in a paraprofessional position. Is that it's important to understand that because of working with individuals, that is probably the most intensive and craziest thing that we're gonna do, right? And you, as much as you want to be able to control the thoughts and feelings of another person, you're not able to do that. And it's gonna drive you a bit batty. But I want you to entrust the help of the returners, the other staff members, your support network, all of us, in that you are going to see the other side of it. And it might not be a perfect pink piece of paper. I'm just gonna X out of that. It didn't like me. Oh, it doesn't matter. But I want to remind you that this is a process, right? And just like anything in the process, you have to be invested in the process. So, other thoughts about Tuckman's model?
Share your thoughts, please. New people, share your thoughts.
A hot mic. I'll be here all night. Tuckman going once. Tuckman going twice. Sold two and did some reminders. So, van, paperwork, and then IMU Leads. Oh yes, oh my gosh, great reminder. So, you have to register for it. IMU Leads is when? Who's going to give a plug for IMU Leads? It's not me. It's next Saturday. What time? Noon to 5, right? IMU Leads is noon to 5. IMU Leads is noon to 5. There is somebody that, I know we have a bunch of student leaders that are presenting. So raise your hand if you know you're presenting or submitted a proposal to present. I know some of. Okay.
Alan Brown, raise your hand.
I know.
That's my RA!
There's also a chance to win, I think, a book voucher for next year, maybe an iPad. There's some other things that you can win, so that's really cool to go to. And then you get Greek Week points. Great. Great. That's the word on the street. So make sure that you register for that. Do you all have a link in your Millikan email to sign up? Yes.
Yes, it came from Tanya Hines. She sends it like almost every day.
Yeah, so you should have a copy of that. If you have any other questions, in the back, whenever you checked in, there was a check-in sheet. Make sure that you checked in. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Clean up, throw away your spaghetti.